Excellencies, representatives of government, members of the diplomatic corps, survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, Director Nates, ladies and gentlemen. This is truly the most extraordinary honor. I get to talk about my artwork a lot, to many different audiences, but standing here at Kwibuka 28, before representatives of the government of Rwanda, survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, and family members of those who perished, is an honor that I will always cherish. Thank you. I grew up in Zimbabwe, and to be honest, I don't remember specifically learning about the Holocaust. It was just always there. My grandmother's sister had the Auschwitz tattoo, clearly stamped on her left forearm. We weren't allowed to ask her about it, but somehow we always knew the story, or so I thought. We think we know that story. The whole world thinks it knows the story of genocide, and so we stop empathizing, we stop paying attention, and we stop taking action. And by so doing, we become complicit in its recurrence. It is that recurrence, the recurrence of the ultimate crime against humanity, that is the focus of my art practice. My thought process, and by extension my work, is anchored in the ethics of seeing. How do we think about our individual and collective responsibility of bearing witness? To date, I have worked at sites of genocide in Poland, Ukraine, Namibia, and of course, Rwanda. As we gather here today, those same landscapes in Ukraine are yet again bearing witness to human atrocities. Later this year, I will travel to Bosnia to work on the landscapes around Srebrenica that bore witness to the genocide there in 1995. But today, I am here to talk to you about my work in Rwanda. But first, I would like to explain why I have dedicated 10 years of my art practice to looking at the topic of genocide. In 2013, I did a project that addressed the Holocaust. It included video of Auschwitz survivors recounting their experiences. And when that work screened at video and film festivals around the world, people would often respond in that familiar language of genocide fatigue by saying it was a narrative they knew. We may not know that lady in the white shirt, people would say to me, but we know her story. And I would always respond with a simple question. If we know that story so well, help me understand why we have repeated it 12 times since World War II. So I told you that I too thought I knew that story. But after spending 100 hours with Auschwitz survivors and their families in the summer of 2013, I realized that we will never know their story. We will never be able to comprehend what a victim of genocide endures. And it was then that I committed to myself that I would never stop trying. So in my resolve to challenge that jaded perception that we know the story, I embarked on what would be my ongoing body of work. I committed to exploring the recurrence of genocide and how we enable it. But how was I going to re-engage people in a different way about subject matter that they think they know? In my work, I presuppose that whatever we can learn from a didactic approach, the fact-based approach of the historian, the academic, the documentarian, or the journalist, has already been learnt. And still, we continue to perpetuate the cycle of the ultimate crime against humanity. So I needed to figure out a way to engage people differently. How do you engage people creatively to make aesthetic images instead of documenting brutal facts? So I set out to make work that leaves room for the imagination and allows place for personal interpretation. I came upon the idea of using the landscape in metaphoric ways to link places of genocide. It all happens under the same sky and on the same earth. But of course, it is we that are the true connective tissue between those atrocities. The landscape, like us, sees everything and does nothing. Like us, it stands by in full view of the atrocities being committed, and the trees shed their leaves in complicity and cover-up. But the landscape also rejuvenates, restores, and recovers. It carries with it the traces of the past and the promises of the future. It triumphs over trauma. It is inextricably intertwined with our darkest moments, but also our brightest days. Nowhere in the world is that story of triumph over trauma and of restoration and recovery more poignant than in Rwanda. I have titled my ongoing body of landscape works, How We See the World. It is a series of abstract landscapes from sites of 20th century genocide. In Rwanda, the metaphoric idea of landscape as witness is particularly fitting. There is no landscape in that small and beautiful country that did not bear witness to the atrocities of 1994. Many of you will recognize the location of this triptych as Lake Kivu in Rwanda. I made this work in the front yard of the church next door to Home St. John. The title of this work is A Ravaged Land Healing, 1, 2, and 3. And for me, this work captures the essence of what it is that I'm trying to say about the events of 1994 in Rwanda. It is perhaps ironic that I go to great lengths to find very precise locations where acts of genocide have been perpetrated, and then I make these abstract pictures which could have been made anywhere. And there are two reasons for that. The one is my hope that it reminds us that that place can very quickly become any place. And secondly, my hope is that it gives the viewer a chance to interpret the work as their own, to place themselves in the picture. I think a lot about the concept of veils in my work, the metaphoric veils or filters through which we view history that somehow absolve us of our responsibility to honor our collective promise of never again. I can best explain it by thinking of a child who watches a scary movie through the gaps between their fingers. The movie hasn't changed. We know exactly what's going on, but somehow it allows us to be less afraid, less accountable, and less responsible. The final landscape I want to show you is called What Was and Will Be. And this is perhaps one of my most literal works, since it clearly talks to the idea of light breaking through the darkness. But what we're here to talk about today is the exhibition that will open after this afternoon's program, The Day I Became Another Genocide Victim. It is a series of 100 posthumous portraits of victims of the genocide as represented by what they were wearing on the last day of their lives. It is something completely different from my regular artwork. It is not the type of work that I make. The pictures you will see behind me, I did not set out to make those pictures. They do not feel like my work, unlike the landscapes, which is entirely mine. They're my ideas, my concept, my aesthetic treatment. I went looking for those landscapes. But the portraits in The Day I Became Another Genocide Victim, that work found me. Let me explain what I mean by that. I was working in Rwanda on landscapes in April of 2018 under the guidance of two genocide activists, Paul Rukesha and Patrick Nkubana. I'm so very grateful to Paul and Patrick, as well as to the Aegis Trust and the Kigali Genocide Memorial for making my work in Rwanda possible. While I was there, a news story broke that a new mass grave had just been discovered in Kwibuka village. just on the outskirts of Kigali. The initial estimates were that there were 3,000 to 5,000 people buried there. So I went to the excavation site simply to give my work context. I wanted to better feel what had transpired on that land 24 years before. I had no intention of photographing there. We spent an emotional hour at the site as clothes were being piled up, still damp with earth. But then we continued onto our next landscape location. And for the next 2 days, I couldn't focus, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't get the piles of clothes out of my mind. Crumpled, muddied, and in growing heaps, they just seemed to further compound the dehumanizing way that their owners had lost their lives. I felt compelled to do something, but I wasn't sure what. So we got permission to return to the site. Working there with the CNLG volunteers, we started to separate the clothes, to consider each as the person it was. I felt that the need to lay out each of these garments one by one and photograph them as a portrait. And so we began to work. It was overwhelmingly emotional because both Paul and Patrick had identified where their family members had fallen by the clothes that had been recovered from a mass grave. And so it is with the deepest respect and sensitivity that I present this work, because I understand how confronting it is for Rwandans. The clothes take on heightened meaning because so frequently they were the only way to identify where loved ones had fallen. Soon after we started, I wanted to stop. We were working through tears. I wanted to spare Paul and Patrick from reliving their trauma. And in all honesty, I wanted to spare myself the emotional distress. But each time I had that overwhelming emotion, I challenged myself to continue. I thought about the words of French philosopher George D.D. Huberman, and he writes, "Let us not invoke the unimaginable, but instead force ourselves into that oppressive place of imagining. Because the minute we stop imagining, the moment we invoke the unimaginable, we stop empathizing, we stop being present, and we become complicit in the problem." And so D.D. Huberman implores us to continue to imagine. As you will notice in the portrait series when you take a closer look, each has a text in the first person. I was wearing my favorite party dress. I was wearing my little crochet leggings. Sometimes I slept in them too. Or I was carrying my doggy backpack. The text is my invitation to you to work with me, to feel what I felt when I was making this work. I was shooting portraits of people. I was not making still lives of objects. This work is my effort to humanize the victims. We can never, ever comprehend what 1 million dead people is like, but we can readily imagine the life story of this little boy and his doggy backpack. He had a mother and a father and a grandmother and grandfather and uncles and friends and teachers. He lived at the very center of his own life story until the day he was murdered. Many of the portraits in this project are of children, and that was not intentional. I had asked the volunteers at the site to help me find complete garments as opposed to rags or fragments, because that helped me imagine the person that I was making the portrait of. After a while of shooting, I realized I was shooting a disproportionate number of children's clothes. So I asked the volunteer for a more representative sample of the people that had been murdered at the site. But she reminded me that I'd asked for complete garments, and most of the adults had been hacked to pieces by machete, and all that remained were rags and fragments. So it is in recognition of this truth, a truth we must imagine, that I have included a few partial garments in the exhibition of 100 works. I returned to Kwibuka in November of 2018. The excavation was complete. In total, they had recovered the remains of 84,439 people. That is a shockingly high number by any account, but all the more difficult to comprehend because that was almost 25 years after the genocide. When you start a project of this nature, where do you stop? Is one single shoe enough? Or do you just continue to shoot hundreds of thousands of images until our capacity to feel is numbed? And what about those you don't get to? I felt a responsibility to them too. But I remembered the story of a survivor, and she told how she had survived by pretending to be dead, lying under a pile of bloodied, dismembered bodies, when she heard one of the perpetrators say, "I just need one more and I'll have 100. Those words haunted me. I forced myself to imagine how that woman felt, fearing for her life and hearing the perpetrator reduce human life to a number. I just need one more and I'll have 100. If she could endure that, I could surely stay present to make 100 images and imagine the lives of those 100 people. But I stopped after the 100th image to honor that woman's story of survival. The last image in the series, as you will see, is an empty gray square. There is no object identifying a person. It's simply a barren gray square with the words, "We were." And that's in recognition of all those victims who will never be individually identified. I have questioned myself and have been challenged by others about whether, in fact, this is my story to tell. And in conclusion, I would like to explain to you why I think it is. And not only is it mine to tell, but it belongs to all of us, and we have a duty to never stop telling it. While we were in Rwanda, we were driving to a small, remote village to shoot a landscape, traversing potholes as big as the four-wheel drive vehicle we were in. And I asked, how in the world did the perpetrators get there? And I was reminded that they didn't. They were already there. As you heard earlier, many victims of the genocide were killed by somebody they knew. Citizen turned on citizen, neighbor on neighbor. People who had never killed before became murderers, family members, clergy, doctors, teachers, and so the list continues. Mostly, they were incited by simple propaganda spread over the radio. So we have to ask ourselves, what would it take for any one of us to hack someone we know to pieces with a machete? The events of 1994 in Rwanda warn us that it may not take very much. It reminds us that humanity hangs in precarious balance. I identify as part of this amorphous thing called humanity, and so do most of the people on this planet. What happened in Rwanda challenges our very understanding of what humanity is and highlights its fragility. I believe that gives each of us a claim to the history of the genocide in Rwanda. In fact, more than that, I believe it gives us each a responsibility to tell that story and to retell it in any way we can, as often as we can, to any audience we can. That is our duty to ensure a more humane tomorrow. In closing, in my faith, when we wish condolences to the family members of someone who's passed away, we wish them a long life. So today, on the 28th anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsi, I would like to wish all Rwandans a long life. Thank you.